Okay. Hello, everybody. Since it's just gone 6:30, I'd like to start proceedings. My name's Sarah Ansari, and I'm currently president of the Royal Asiatic Society. And it's with, as they say, great pleasure that I'm very happy to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Mallika Leuzinger, who was the winner of the Bailey Prize for, I was going to say 1921, sorry, 2021. And just to give a bit of background, Mallika is currently a postdoctoral fellow at the German Historical Institute in London. You were trained as a historian and then in gender studies at Cambridge, and you moved then, didn't you, to UCL to do your PhD in the history of art. You've worked in various sectors, the museum sector, the heritage sector, in India, in Europe, and you've also held a prestigious postdoctoral research fellowship at Princeton University and also in Berlin. So you come to us with a very impressive track record. I'm sure many of us are envious of what you've been able to achieve in what is a very short career so far. Today you're going to be speaking to us on a topic linked to your PhD thesis, which you've entitled Amateur Photography in and Beyond 20th Century India. I'm going to hand over to you, Mallika, and look forward to hearing your lecture. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very, very much for being here. And I don't know who's online, but also for being online. Okay. So in 1931, the German Jewish philosopher and essayist Walter Benjamin, who was living between the bustling metropoles of Paris and Berlin, published his now canonical A Little History of Photography. As noted by a recent translator, it was a treatise on how photography weaves into lives that are changing and that would change more. Benjamin had himself been born into a world in which photography was becoming commonplace. But as Esther Leslie continues, it compelled him because, and these are her words, or his words and her words, it had transported moments into the future and so bent time. It had made faraway spaces, the other side of the world, the moon, the stars, the sun, recordable and transportable into every bourgeois parlor, and later through magazines and postcards into every home and circumstance. It had altered the meaning and the function of memory. It had made its mark on the body, calling poses and postures into being. It had produced new sensations, such as the shock of the moment of exposure, and new gestures, such as the photographer bent over his machine and unleashing his act with a crook of his finger. Benjamin's reflections have since spawned hundreds of other little histories, and this attempt to grapple with the photographic lives of the Bengali Hindu twin sisters, Debalina and Manobina, is no exception, not least because his essay was published just as the twins first began to wield a camera in and around the North Indian town of Ramnagar. They had turned 12, and to mark the occasion, their father, Binod Bihari Sen Roy, who was a teacher in the employ of the Maharaja of Benares and a member of the Royal Photographic Society of Great Britain, had gifted them an Agfa Brownie. This camera, a spin-off of the wildly popular Kodak Brownie, was kind of a cardboard box, could be held at waist level. You could choose between two windows. You shoot either a landscape or a portrait. You press down on the shutter to take the image and you wind it to the next. And with it, Manobina and Debalina were soon photographing prolifically, and yet always with deliberation, becoming proficient in the genres of still life, landscape, and portraiture. Taking meticulous notes and keeping albums, developing black and white photographs in the darkroom, transitioning to their own dual lens medium format cameras, and sharing their work in trans-regional and national amateur photography circles that was springing up around them. The twins were also literary enthusiasts who knew English, Sanskrit, Hindi, Persian, Bengali, and throughout they read poetry, fiction, and non-fiction, and wrote a lot, authoring letters to pen pals around the world, columns for newspapers, and in Manobina's case, an unfinished memoir. Towards the end of their lives, the twins' photography, along with this writing, moved into the realm of their children's memories, homes, and custodian projects, such as Debalina's grandson Raj Sade Dutt's family blog, Lives Less Forgotten. It's also figured in institutional efforts to foreground women in India's modern history. So Debalina's photographs, for instance, were part of this representing Indian women, curated by the New Delhi-based Centre for Women's Development Studies from institutional archives such as the Nehru Memorial Museum and private family collections, and held at the India International Centre in 2001 before travelling to a dozen other cities. A portrait that Debalina made in 1938 of a fresh-faced young woman gathering wheat outside of Ramnagar and captioned "Gleaner" was viewed by international audiences as well, because it graced the cover of the accompanying catalogue and coffee table book, Visualizing Indian Women, 1875 to 1947. Maybe it was chosen for being representative of the spirited character of a photography that emerged out of an affluent upper-caste home, but could connect with other Indians, other visions, other labours. It shares, after all, the romanticized yet deeply respectful, sympathetic gaze of From Day In to Day Out, that one. Debalina's contemporaneous photograph of a line of women labourers carrying pails of sand on their heads, and of Manobina's cropped portrait of a young tribal woman. At the same time, it resonates with the images of rural women across 10 Indian states taken by the photojournalist P. Sainath between 1993 and 2002, which have been seen in the exhibition Visible Work, Invisible Women by many viewers in India alone, and also was fully digitized and made freely available and in the People's Archive of Rural India, which I anyway suggest you take a look at, unrelated to these things. So Debalina lent this picture Gleaner and over 100 other photographs in her possession to the Kolkata-based Centre for Studies in the Social Sciences to be scanned such that they also exist as digital files, merging with the other images and micro and macro histories the Centre archives and sometimes exhibits. The twins' photography also attracted media coverage, their own ways of talking about it, or indeed talking it down, straining against maybe this journalistic tendency to simplify or exceptionalize it. So in an article for the Telegraph Kolkata, Debalina was described as one of our first women photographers, though she herself would be the last person to lay any claims to any pioneering effort. Photography was not for her the means of breaking what may be perceived as the shackles of domesticity. On the contrary, she nurtured her talent within the safe environment of her home. Exposing herself to the world outside would have been unthinkable for one as conservative as she. Aside from mistakenly identifying Debalina as the only one of Sen Roy's daughters to take to photography, the article did this thing of placing her on the side of tradition rather than modernity, as someone seeking containment rather than exposure, which is kind of undone by her being profiled in one of the region's most prominent English newspapers. But this slippage attests to the difficulty of finding an adequate vocabulary or framing for this photography, one that, like Benjamin's, can reckon with the strange politics of the camera, its inability to adhere or to cohere to a set of spaces and relations, its capacity to be both acutely intimate and radically cosmopolitan, its tendency to preserve and transform, efface and illuminate, concentrate and disperse, alienate and inspire. The most sensitive discussion of their photography is an article written by the media scholar Sabina Gadihok. She conducted interviews with Debalina and Manobina, the sisters Meera Chowdhury and Indra Dey, who hailed from a prominent Brahmo family, and Rajendra Kunverba, who was the Rajmata of Kutch. And through this, she traced the development of photography amongst middle and upper-class women in 20th century India. She focused on how photography was deemed a suitable activity for young girls from these backgrounds because it could be practiced within the home, in these cases often a sprawling one with multiple indoor and outdoor spaces. And through these postal portfolio clubs, she noted that, in quotes, it allowed women to do things that they normally did not do. It allowed them to wander, to look, and to stare, end quote. As their movement was in relation to a respectable activity, or at least this is what Kodak was desperately trying to promote in its ads featuring a smiling, sari-clad Kodak girl with a camera in hand, presiding over a quaint street scene. Moreover, it was an activity that they could adjust around their schedules and duties as daughters, later wives and mothers, and so it complemented rather than compromised these. And making this argument, Gadihok points to the suspension and divergence of aspects of their photography after their marriages. So Manobina married the socialist realist Bengali filmmaker Binod Roy in 1937 and settled after a brief stint in Calcutta in Bombay, while Debalina accompanied her father to Benares and obtained a degree from the BHU as a private candidate. afterwards marrying a businessman, Nitish Chandra Majumdar, in 1946 and moving to Calcutta. The demands of setting up and running their own households, having children, supporting their husbands' professional lives meant that photography took a backseat, or it revolved mostly around having to photograph the family. Manobina did manage some portraits of distinguished acquaintances such as the Bengali poet and Nobel laureate Rabindranath Tagore, and Jawaharlal Nehru became the first Prime Minister of India after its independence in 1947 from the British, and then his sister, the diplomat Vijayalakshmi Pandit. Debalina, meanwhile, did produce a striking series on the Durga Puja that her city is so known for, and she dreamt of publishing this as a photo book. But insofar as it did materialize as an album, it had to contend with her children's scribbles and attentions. It was only years later that Debalina subscribed to Viewfinder, a journal published by the Federation of Indian Photography, excitedly discovered that its founders were known to her from her days in this United Provinces Portfolio Club, and resumed their friendship, which resulted in her joining the Photography Association of Bengal and eventually being elected its president. It was around this time, too, that the twins themselves were reunited. Manobina joining Debalina in a rented house in London for 3 months after accompanying her husband to the Moscow Film Festival in 1959. Though they were in charge of a total of 8 children, with Debalina's youngest receiving medical treatment at the Great Ormond Street Hospital, they spent every free moment in parks, streets, theatres, and shops, their cameras hanging ever ready over their saris. Upon their return to India, via Paris and Geneva, Manobina published some of these photographs with accompanying text in the Illustrated Weekly of India, which counted amongst the most read and respected English magazines. In a Sunday afternoon in Hyde Park, she confidently took to task the racism and desolation she experienced in the former imperial metropole. It is worth reading in full, but I particularly like her inclusion of an anecdote about how, in quotes, a pavement artist, claiming to be the oldest in the profession in London, objected vehemently when I tried to photograph him at Hyde Park Corner with his interesting collection of paintings. He was so rude to me that I came away in a huff from the gaping crowd, which was apparently quite startled to see an Indian woman in this angry mood. I was more successful with the next artist, but just as I snapped him, he stepped in front of with his back to me, obscuring the view of his paintings. I could not help thinking how willingly people in India allow themselves or their surroundings, however sordid, to be photographed by foreigners. Her article entitled Impressions of Moscow, meanwhile, included insistences such as her saying, I should make it quite clear here that I am not politically inclined to like or dislike the land of the Soviets. I went there as a visitor with an open mind. So in tracking this ebb and flow of the twins' camera work, its careful movement through the home and beyond, and across the decades, Gadi Hope concluded that photography, in quotes, served as a temporary escape from a situation that left women with no time for themselves or for a fantasy world, and, in quotes, provided a significant space for self-expression. In this paper, I build on her insights to continue tracing how the twins, as photographing women, and crucially also as citizens of a newly independent and non-aligned nation, became producers, critics, and representatives of an ambitious, pragmatic, but also problematic post-colonial modernity. I hope to move then from the idea of photography as providing, serving, allowing outcomes as a kind of neat space of itself towards an understanding of how photography, following Benjamin, is all about contingency, or following Roland Barthes, constitutes disturbance. I argue that the sparks of this little history of photography surrounding Manobina and Debalina are not individuals, clubs, exhibitions, or the assumptions of or denial of women's self-expression, but inclinations, experiments, contradictions that might be gathered together under the term amateurism. Of course, this term is already intimately connected to the discourse, practice, and circulation of photography, beginning in the late 19th century and transnational in character, by people identifying, at times defending themselves as amateur photographers. It's a term that the twins' father, Sen Roy, would quite possibly have used to distinguish his activity from that of snap shooters, who simply took photographs whilst on holiday or at a family gathering, and had no interest in learning about technical aspects of the medium, and from that of professionals for whom it was a means of income and or the result of institutional training. It certainly surfaced in Debalina's daughter's Kamalini's descriptions of her grandfather, who would lead, these are her words, lead the twins into his dark room, where they sat enthralled as the images magically appeared on the negatives and later on the prints. My mother, while talking about her childhood and later years, would tell us about the excitement of watching images appear on a seemingly blank sheet of paper as the prints were washed and put through a fixer. Their father would leaf through the journals, make the girls look at the pictures printed there, and sometimes point to a particular picture and ask them to critically evaluate it. Later, he would tell them about aesthetics, composition, lighting, the use of filters. So in a way, even before the sisters were wielded a camera, they had been thoroughly schooled in the art of photography. Pamelini's words. Moreover, once they began photographing, Sen Roy insisted they follow his example of taking notes. Pamelini claiming that, in quotes, they would often experiment with a permutation and combination of the aperture and exposure using the same subject. And this practice helped them figure out what worked best under certain conditions. It's no wonder then that the back of the print you saw before, day in and day out, has these kinds of annotations. Sen Roy was, as mentioned, a member of the RPS, which was established in 1853 in London, a place he himself had never been to, with the aim of, in quotes, promoting the art and science of photography through the interchange of thought and experience among photographers. Details of this interchange can be gleaned from its annual magazines. And so here is one from 1913 that's been recently digitized by the National Media Museum in Bradford. And you see his name and his address and date of election, 1908, alongside other fellows spread across the British Empire. And its contents kind of range from articles on techniques and processes of photography, ads for equipment, predominantly pictorial work that was selected from the annual exhibition, but there are also documents about the membership application process, the fees, the RPS's connections, its royal patronage. They conjure a kind of history, a cosmopolitan history of consumption, sociality, and aesthetic production in which metropole and colony, colonizer and colonized exist on the same page. Indeed, as photographers, they're not so much identified as colonizer and colonized, but rather as more part of a more or less elite global community invested in certain forms of imperial or colonial aesthetic production, intrigued and inspired by technological developments and cross-cultural networks of modernity to invest further. In the twins' case, this interchange was no longer so imperially or royally oriented, but acquiring federal, secular, nationalist leanings and grit. Their official entry into amateur photography was marked by their involvement in this portfolio club, which Pamelini described to me as a unique system whereby members sent in one photograph per person along with a comment sheet. The relevant details about the photograph had to be provided by the photographer. After that, all the photographs collected were put into a folder and circulated amongst the members. Each member had to pen comments about the other photographs before returning the folder, and a nominal fee was charged for postage. After doing a complete round, the photographs were returned to the people they belonged to. Indeed, by the 1960s, the twins' photographs had become affixed with stamps and stickers, and in the officious English language of these, accepted and exhibited through networks that had in some ways shrunk with the UP. I used to go up to what is now Afghanistan, but in other ways expanded on their fathers, so going down to South India. So you have this print of Debalina's photograph of the Divani Khas in Delhi, which was taken in 1936, and it travels to Lucknow, and it travels to something that, by the Lens Club of Calcutta. And you have Manobina's print of a naked toddler picking flowers in the garden, which features in the 1965 All India Photographic Association, hosted by the Vishaka Camera Club, and then in the 1966 Andhra Pradesh Salon of Photography. Andhra Pradesh being the unexpected first state formed on linguistic grounds after a constitutional crisis prompted by the death of the hunger-striking Telugu activist Poti Sriramalu in 1952. So the post-colonial credentials of the twins' amateurism were not only manifest in and on their prints, but in their attitudes to photographic technologies. Raj Sade, Debalina's grandson, described his aunt, as the very antithesis of the modern digital photographer who discards hundreds of shots to find just the right one, emphasizing her keen awareness of the expense analog photography incurred, and the resultant way in which, in quotes, she would plan the shots, almost see them in her mind before shooting, and agonize over them. Pamelini also offered me a characterization of her mother as simple and self-reliant, unfazed by quickly changing trends and automation offered by the latest gadgets. In the 1970s, she recalls that Debalina bought a Nikon F, the first really sophisticated SLR camera she had. where the dual-lens reflex cameras required the photographer to judge the aperture and exposure and set them accordingly, used 120 films and meant that the negatives were in a square format, the SLR had a built-in exposure meter, a different film format. Kamali was tremendously admiring of how her mother, in quotes, adapted to the new camera without so much as blinking an eye. But she rarely consulted the exposure meter, relying instead on her instincts and experience. Manobina also wanted to establish that she was not enamored by technological advancements, even if she, unlike her sister, pleaded guilty to having succumbed to them. In her memoirs, she wrote, "I cannot now do without an exposure meter. The more we depend on machines, our own power of deduction, analysis, and decision-making become non-existent or weak." In fact, the stress on selection, thrift, planning, self-reliance in the face of discombobulating abundance, scarcity, or rapidly changing circumstances engages so many of the particularities and contradictions of Indian modernity. You have this kind of Gandhian resistance to and critique of modern technology, a kind of Nehruvian belief in the importance of scientific method and rationality. And it's also inflected by the spirit of non-alignment that was coming into being. As Srinath Raghavan put it, it was a foreign policy comprising, in quotes, first, the importance of retaining the capacity for independent judgment and action on the international stage. Second, the avoidance of military alliances and arms races. Third, working towards a more just and equitable international order, in pursuit of which Nehru proposed anti-colonialism, anti-racism, concerted move away from economic underdevelopment, and the building of ever-widening areas of peace. This righteous post-colonial ambition, which Nehru articulated more briefly in a 1947 speech where he said, "We do not intend to be the playthings of others," is increasingly being acknowledged as having been broadcast into being, as argued by Sri Roy for millions of Indians. Roy's focus is on the continuous consolidation of this ambition via the annual Republic Day Parade, documentary films produced by the Films Division of India, and the techno-scientific schemes introduced by the 5-year plan, such as the steel towns built to house the workers of nationalized steel plants. Other scholars have focused more on how this ambition was remade through small but decisive acts of agency by countless ordinary people firmly convinced of the justice of their aims, in quotes, or the ideology and pragmatism of their own visions. Such acts, amongst which the twins' photography may be, and most obviously their European encounters might be counted, are what Taylor C. Sherman, Sarah Ansari, and William Gold might have in mind when referring to the post-1947 decades as a formative period in South Asian history in terms of citizenship, the politics of development, and the secular state, and a time in which the nature of the state and the content of citizenship were keenly contested. So in the introduction to subjects, the citizens, they describe how, in quotes, members of the population frequently voiced their disappointment with the failures of their new government servants to live up to the expectations that citizens be given fair access to goods and services, noting with interest that, in quotes, these expectations were often coupled with a quiet willingness on the part of citizens who use their own guile to circumvent or manipulate the services that the state did provide. Joya Chatterjee has also argued that following the announcement of partition, the steps taken by local constables, non-commissioned soldiers, spies, railway guards, and ship captains who handled the flow of migrants without any sanctions from above or records for the tenet of law were as productive as, if not counterproductive, to the policies instituted by the Constituent Assembly of India. She also notes the ways in which South Asian citizenship practices traveled beyond the subcontinent, affecting the status of overseas Indians, having an impact upon the citizenship norms of the countries where they lived. Chatterjee thus suggests, in quotes, the diffusion of ideas and practices regarding citizenship have flown in more than one direction, and that the history of citizenship may be far more multi-sided, entangled, and intertwined than historians have previously assumed. I'm not insisting that the process of turning from subjects to citizens and of this forging and disruption of policy from unexpected realities and quite grim ones necessarily constitutes amateurism. But the strategies, performances, and confrontations they entail have helped me to think about the twins' activity. I can't help but think of the twins and their father when Roy identifies, in quotes, how the practice of citizenship was depicted in tutelary and pedagogical terms as a learning activity or an ongoing process of acquiring skills and attributes, rather than an already possessed right or claim that could be exercised in the present. And then of how and why photography was for them such a serious undertaking. But if the word amateurism summons a clear set of photographic or more generally historic lineages, and cultures. It's also methodologically generative for me because it doesn't do that. After all, its etymology of doing something for the love of invokes fondness, curiosity, rivalry, assemblage, innovation, not limited to a specific site or type of production. It's a littleness and a slightness that is hugely capable. It involves, too, a shift away from the politics of identity and subjectivity towards a politics of activity and encounter. For although amateurism might involve a subject, it's an amorphous one at best, a lover, a rogue agent, a bricoleur. It's the subject anyway likely to get utterly carried away, dissolved into, or transformed in the pursuit of their passion. Amateurism also comes with its baggage. In the twins' times, it wasn't so much a desire, but also the only recourse against long-established and formal legal and social exclusions. So, for instance, Marilyn Ogilvy refers to women in the arts and sciences. She specifically considers astronomy in the late 19th, early 20th century, who were barred from professional status and basically became obligatory amateurs. So by proceeding with this term, I'm not denying the structural oppressions that produced and sustained amateurism, nor am I endorsing this kind of misogynistic tradition of dismissing or deriding the aesthetic engagements of women or people of color more generally as amateur. Rather, I'm trying to come up with some new conceptions of it altogether. And in my dissertation, I draw on Edward Said's 1993 Reith lectures, which I recommend because it's where I first started thinking of amateurism as a stubborn force or a spirit that he says is neither totally rebellious nor totally acquiescent, but can enter and transform the routine, the everyday, the most personal of projects into something much more lively and radical. Tonight, I want to turn to a literary endeavour that, like Said's lectures, apparently has nothing to do with photography. Some years after winning the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction, the Bengali-American author Jhumpa Lahiri moved from writing novels in English to reading, speaking, and writing in Italian. She begins, in other words, a book she wrote in Italian and subsequently had translated by someone else by admitting, "I don't have a real need to know this language. I have only the desire." But ultimately, a desire is nothing but a crazy need. As in many passionate relationships, my infatuation will become a devotion, an obsession. There will always be something unbalanced, unrequited. Lahiri's embrace of Italian is consequently a painstaking process in which she gropes her way like a child, like a semi-literate, remains acutely aware of her obstacles. I know that I lack true mastery. I know that my writing in Italian is something premature, reckless, always approximate. But because of this, she finds the freedom to be imperfect. Such words point, among other things, to amateurism as a protective impulse. Lahiri is a non-Italian, non-European brown woman, neither expected nor encouraged to have an interest in, let alone know this quintessential Romance language. She is liable to be called an imposter, censored for trespassing and overreaching. But she's able to persevere in her activity by cloaking herself in this armor of apprenticeship and imperfection, feigning and certainly claiming ignorance and disavowing mastery. The twins and their children and grandchildren also referred on multiple occasions to moments in their photographic lives as an education and a learning process. And this pedagogical orientation, for its part, also evokes the proletarian amateurism espoused by Joe Spence and Terry Dennett in Photography Workshop, which was based on open-ended collaborative practice and de-skilling. Also, makes me think of Riza Horowitz, who's a contemporary artist who kind of pushed amateurism as a critical method of art making. So she joined the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada to become an amateur astronomer, to then pursue this technically demanding and long-running project based around capturing images of Saturn as it orbits the sun, and then setting off this process of networking and knowledge sharing that productively expands and blurs the boundaries between practices and disciplinary domains. So the twins' photography was for me just as contingent. It developed not just through their father's guidance and the photographic literature and associations they accessed, but also in close connection to marital and maternal responsibilities, reading novels, poetry, magazines. In Manobina's case, to extend to all of this writing, and Debalina's to her university studies, her love for gardening and botany, her philanthropic interests. These connections shaped the range of subjects and styles they knew to photograph, and produced the rich language that sheltered, sometimes by downplaying, their photography in their own and others' memories. So this combination of craftiness and craftfulness behind their photography makes it possible to connect it to other practices by other women. And in doing so, it kind of demonstrates how amateur engagements are saturated with a transformative power, even when their makers and doers shy away from any clear politics or are not considered political agents. When I met Komalini in a Calcutta cafe a few years ago, she had brought with her a selection of photograph albums. We spent the whole morning looking over and talking over them. One bore the charmingly handwritten title Sweet Memories, 1935, and the signature Lina Bina, a moniker the twins derived by conjoining Debalina and Manobina. Kamalini notified me that this was the oldest album in her possession, possibly the first relating to their activity. Silverfish Eaten barely held together anymore. These albums were, as it turned out, not at all about sweetness and light, nor really about representing family life, but rather akin to Jhumpa Lahiri's ascent or descent into Italian. They attest to an obsessive identification of the elements which make up each photograph, how this would manifest on paper once their Kodachrome film, known for its high resolution, and which Raj Sadeh had said Debalina was so loath to waste, was developed and processed. Their landscape techniques were similar to those employed by Bengali photographers such as Mahim Chandra Thakur, which Ranu Roy Chaudhary has done a really fascinating dissertation about in relation to the culture of photography developing in 20th century Bengal. And so she cites Thakur saying how he would, I got out with my camera in the morning after the previous night's rain, and that is the most favorable time for introducing pictorial effect in the photographs. On the very day, the sunlight was not harsh and sky was cloudy, causing the frame to have a nice and soft effect because the light and the dark contrast was not high. This kind of light condition is important, otherwise underexposure takes away the details in the frames and overexposure makes the image flat. These kinds of words resonate with the experiential and meticulous nature of so many of the twins' photographs. Clouds gathered over water, light beams through the forest clearings. The twins' photographs of people and animals, meanwhile, entailed being creative with more man-made materials, pulling together curtains, opening or closing doors, placing or removing a carpet. They demanded proficiency in judging the most appropriate distance from which to stand or crouch with a camera to get the appropriate focus, and in being ever ready to press down on the camera shutter in that precise moment when their living and breathing subject was ideally aligned against the light or had dropped their self-consciousness and relaxed into the act of posing. The varying degrees of involvement in this encounter by their subjects, on the other hand, suggest how this obsession could alienate or infect. In the case of the men, it is unclear whether their consent was given or demanded, but either way, they appear generally unbothered. Some are too busy applying themselves to the task at hand, transporting building materials, constructing wooden frames, to notice the presence of one or two photographing girls. Others are bemused but alert in their body language. In comparison to the manual labor and drudgery of carrying out domestic employment, they might have found it pleasurable to sit down and simply pose for a camera, or to dress up and immerse themselves in a theatrical performance for the children of the house. With their mother Kiranmoyi and sister Anasuya, can't help thinking that their cooperation was tempered by a degree of aloofness. They're slight figures in the memorializations around the twins' photography, with Kiranmoyi noted for her strict adherence to Purda and other traditions of elite Hindu Bengali femininity, and Anasuya for having been married off at an early age. So their orthodox lifestyles could explain why they appear so demure in these 1930s albums, and not at all in later photographs, but their tendency to face away from or rather then into the camera might also be their response to being excluded from or living on the margins of Sen Roy's and the twins' amateurism, so only ever being photographic subjects at the whims of those behind the camera. The inverse is how Sen Roy, who was so used to wielding a camera, is an enigmatic yet also blank presence throughout. Bathed in worlds of smoke or in his signature shawl, his expressions are unreadable, but not due to shyness, rather because of his awareness and acceptance of being called on as a photographic subject, not really their dad. He features in those images, which Komalini identified as the result of her mother wanting to try her hand at light tricks or this kind of silhouette series. So you have this kind of gestural exchange between father, daughter, master, apprentice, teacher, student, and also as single apparitions. And it was kind of a translation Debalina made of a puppet shadow play that she had seen in her mind for a couple of days. In them, the qualities of the silhouette merge with the texture and feel of the photograph as a physical print, an intermingling which continues into the morphing of the photographs against aging black album paper. A portrait of Sen Roy, digitized by CSSS but attributed with a question mark to Manobina, actually, offers another intense engagement with the silhouette, this time enhanced by the white wisps of smoke emanating out of his cigarette, the bright glint of his spectacles. So the close reading of the twins' early albums shows that as much as there is a clear-headed pragmatism and modesty about their photography, there's also a recklessness to it, or a kind of amateurism that's about getting absorbed, getting too close, getting carried away to the point of getting lost in photography. This double movement is especially so in the images they made many decades later in Europe, and which I had initially assumed to be straightforward photojournalistic kind of attempts, because they were communicating sights or truths to their families and fellow Indians back home, and had appeared in the pages of the Illustrated Weekly of India. So both Manobina and Debalina photographed a solitary female figure reading. Manobina's photograph functions as a portrait. According to her daughter Rinki, who was the oldest of the children in this trip they'd gone on, she remembers that Manobina simply had to photograph this woman as she reminded her so of Miss Marple from the Agatha Christie novels she adored. She is closely framed, the wrinkles on her face and the brooch pinned to her coat are visible, emphasizing that Manobina must have moved with utmost subtlety in order to have not disturbed her with the sound of her camera or the crunch of dried leaves under her feet. Debalina's photograph, meanwhile, is scenic, her attention caught as much by the woman's reading as by the way in which the light was reflecting off the white handkerchief or the wooden bench she was sitting on or the park in the background. Debalina's photograph likely anticipated two others in the stack of prints that Kamalini had given me to look at. According to Kamalini, it had been very difficult to find an empty bench, but she had this preconceived photograph in her mind. This is what she wanted. So she chose the spot, sat there, stayed put, and she got what she wanted. From the resulting image, it's possible to retrace the slow trickling of Debalina's senses as time passed, her posture very still except for this eye traveling upwards, gauging precisely the moment in which it illuminated the leaves bunched together. That is, one can feel this compulsion that moved Debalina to forget time and all other priorities, perhaps even propriety, working its way into an image of perfect peace and quiet. One can appreciate, maybe, why it was initially titled The Deserted Park, but then these words were scratched out in favor of solitude. It's this atmospheric quality that pervades the twins' images of shops, market stalls, newsstands. In these, it's as if their movement through urban space has been arrested, the scene before them concentrated or emphasized by a table of secondhand books, a quaint set of knickknacks, the front pages of newspapers screaming bloody murder, a wide sheet of glass. Debalina made a series of photographs of the preparatory stages of the autumn sale for women's wear on Oxford Street. And these are at the CSSS, and Manobina has also made a couple of these. Looking at them, I'm reminded of a passage from the Italian novelist Natalia Ginzburg's essay, England, Eulogy and Lament. Ginzburg came to the city in 1960, having experienced fascism, war, and exile in the Italian countryside, and wrote of how shop windows filled to overflowing with shoes that have all the same pointed toes and stiletto heels, and windows brimming over with women's underclothes, so stuffed with merchandise that my eyes feel sated with it, and any desire to buy a slip or a pair of stockings is completely destroyed. The twins, whose retail experiences had hitherto been framed or formed by the strict economic policies of the post-colonial Indian state pre-1991, were evidently also drawn to and repelled by this abundance, by how vendors had set objects out in ways that ranged from the picturesque to the bemusing to the grotesque. Where Ginzburg maybe sought comfort in words, they seem to have turned to their cameras to process this dizzying yet hollow plenitude. Such displays, moreover, allowed the twins to observe and photograph others without being seen themselves. The people in these photographs being so occupied in acts of looking, talking, bargaining, and the streets being much busier than a quiet corner of the park. These images of dizziness, then, are made calm by the very fact of seeing double. They might be thought of as companions to Vivian Maier's more famous, or now more famous, street photography in New York. For Maier continuously returns to glass windows and mirrors as a way of stealthily turning her camera on others while always secretly or playfully acknowledging her own presence. I often find myself returning to this photograph of two women facing each other in a street of yet more windows, in the knowledge that this was taken by exactly such a duo. Both sisters have actually laid claim to the image. I found one copy amongst Manobina's prints, behind which she had written, "Two old ladies meet on the road in London just to say, what a lovely day. They are so lonely that just to be able to talk to someone is a relief." The caption on Debalina's print is simple, roadside gossip. Each time, I think I detect some difference between these prints. I was sure at some point that Debalina's had a slightly different emphasis, a tempo, at another it's simply a closer cropping. I have to double back, just as I do when looking at the women in the photograph, constantly trying to understand where one ends, the other begins, what separates them, what connects them. The two women are so identical in stature, age, clothing, the tilt of their heads, or since one has her back to the camera while the other faces it, it may be more appropriate to call them a unit. Such a reading is prompted, at least in part, by the element of rivalry that existed between the twins. Yet in this photograph, there is space for two, for many. Its doubling, its multiplicity is far from antagonistic. In fact, just like the twins' early photographic appellation of themselves as Lina Bina, it's part and parcel of the different, or the kindred relationality enabled by photography. Here, I also want to show you some of their other portraits, which really emphasize this mutual awareness between the photographer and the photograph. The steady gaze, sometimes even a smile. Or in these photographs, where as much as it is about claiming a subaltern subject for her camera, there seems to be some undercurrent of solidarity. So here, for instance, in attributing to this man the word jobless, I'm struck by how it's a quality rather than him as a jobless man. There's something maybe respectful or dignified about the distance Debalina allows him to have, that she doesn't photograph his face, but actually perhaps is interested in his alienation from urban space and makes that the subject. However, lest we get too carried away by the camera's promise of kinship, it's important to note that so many of their European photographs also speak of impenetrability and alienation. Many of Manobina's photographs feature heavy fog, dark lighting, solid and obscuring arches, unsociable street corners, passers-by whose backs are turned to the camera, either because they were figures she was keen to keep her distance from, or simply could not get close to. All of these are present in a photograph titled "A Mild Pea Super," taken at Aldwych opposite BBC. Where she notes incredulously, dusk sets in at about 3 p.m. in the afternoon. This sensibility, so this is the photo. This sensibility is more than a return to the soft focus, pictorialist emphasis of the early 20th century photography Debalina and Manobina were raised on. It's a visual registration of a reckoning with London as an uncomfortable, inaccessible space. Much like visual histories that are now being collected in volumes like Black Britain and Asian Britain show. Moreover, it's an aesthetic that was also being developed by literary migrants and visitors to London in those exact years. Fog is, for instance, a recurring metaphor in Sam Selvin's 1956 novel, The Lonely Londoners, which tells the story of a motley crew of African-Caribbean Windrush arrivals, that is, men and women who were encouraged by the British government to migrate from the former colonies to the UK to fill labour shortages after World War II. Under the British Nationality Act of 1948, they were technically given British citizenship, but this welcome officially ended with the Commonwealth Immigrants Act of 1962. In any case, this welcome was always thin and no competition for the fog, which hangs thickly and menacingly over Selvin's characters. It never allows them to be comfortable or see clearly. It makes Sir Galahad, the main protagonist, feel hot in winter, cold in summer, and therefore casts him as a misfit, always out of season, out of place, out of time. In England, Eulogy and Lament, Natalia Ginzburg wrote of the openly gloomy and desolate character of the city and how it undercuts its reputation for providing refuge and civility. Ginsberg also references the rows upon rows of terraced houses, each with their little fenced-in back garden. For her, they form the built environment through which white middle-class British notions of privacy and every man to himself attitudes keep out foreigners, especially those used to other, more communal ways of relating to each other and their surroundings. Even in those photographs where the fog has lifted, the sun is out, the mood is lively, there's an insurmountable distance and feeling of discord, as in Manobina's images of people congregating at the Speaker's Corner in Hyde Park. In her article for the Illustrated Weekly, Manobina writes, and this is a long quote, sorry, "She happened to visit on a bright autumn afternoon with my camera. I was amused to see a couple of old women, surely in their 70s, sprawled on the grass, reading avidly some blood-curdling murder report in an evening paper through a magnifying glass. Near them was a fiery orator with a large group of people around him shouting about the injustices of the Conservative government. But he did not seem to disturb the old women in the least. There was a black speaker who was hooted as a liar as he recounted his bitter experiences with the white people. A Hindu orator was also jeered at by some as he talked on Vedanta. Just rot! I was particularly annoyed to see two youngsters of about 10 or 12 leering at the elderly speaker and asking him who taught him to wear a suit and from whom he got his shoes. Some of the listeners encouraged the boys by joining in on the laughter. I was so angry that I cried out to the amazement of bystanders. How very badly these children are brought up, insulting an elderly man. We wouldn't have tolerated it in our country. At this outburst, those around me suddenly looked sheepish and stopped laughing. Manobina's words make no bones about the racist environment in which the last two speakers attempted to speak up for themselves, while also under pressure to appear before a public as post-colonial subjects. Moreover, they draw attention to the righteous and patriotic stance she took in response, using the language of civility so commonly associated with and used by the British to shame them. But she also mobilizes photography, using her camera to highlight how what is happening right in front of these nonchalant members of the public, so literally focused on sensational news stories in print, was itself blood-curdling. She placed her image of the Hindu orator on the top-hand corner of the first page of her article, such that he appears in dignified animation, his strong gesticulating hand held up against a muted crowd and underneath him. This crowd, moreover, includes a man whose face is hidden in his black bowler hat, as if he has indeed been shamed. Given such instances, it's no wonder that decades later, Manobina would tell Sabina in an interview, firmly, emotionally, "Wherever I go, the camera goes with me." Debalina, meanwhile, was even more insistent on this acute, embodied dimension of her photographic vision. At the age of 81, she told Sabina, "I used to dream that I'm going to London or somewhere, and that after going to the airport on the plane, I discover I haven't got my camera. I begin to cry. What will I do without my camera? I had that sort of attachment with it." Somebody once told me that the eye is better than the camera. I said that's all fine, but I would like to go over memories, things as I saw them then. Debalina's attachment to the camera as part of herself, as constituting her subjectivity, her memories, her mobility, her subconscious, without which she is disoriented, bring us back full circle, not only to Walter Benjamin's instinctive grasp of the camera as a historical force to be reckoned with, but also to Jhumpa Lahiri's invocation of the relations her Italian dictionary was capable of generating, perhaps also burdened with. I always put it in my purse. I look up words when I'm in the street, when I return to the hotel after an outing, when I try to read an article in the newspaper. It guides me, protects me, explains everything. It becomes both map and compass. Without it, I know I'd be lost. Indeed, when she forgets to take it with her, she feels slightly uneasy. When a friend suggests she could do without it, or at least upgrade to a better dictionary, for instance, a phone app, she opposes this, describing how over the years it's morphed from a parental figure into a sibling, and yet, or therefore, remains full of secrets. This little book will always be bigger than I am. I end on this not to say that Debalina's camera and Jhumpa Lahiri's dictionary are interchangeable objects or entities in and of themselves, but to emphasize how they attest to an amateurism worth thinking over, even taking on. As Sean Cubitt writes in his manifesto for an amateur aesthetics, there's something radically precious in such readiness to transform every material, to show respect through manipulating and changing what comes into hand, seizing a technology, a technique, a shape or a melody or an image and making it anew. The process is future-directed and open-ended. And in that spirit, I just want to conclude with this image, but also with this exhibition that I've had the luck to be part of organizing and which is opening on the 24th of this month in Calcutta.
Thank you, Mud. That was just so fascinating. I don't know, I just kind of, yeah, I don't know, you just took us on, well, you took us to somewhere far away, but also, I think, close to home as well.
To Aldwych.
Yeah. I think, well, whether there are people in the room or whether there's anybody online that has any questions that they, I see there's one thing in the chat. I don't know if that's a question or just a comment to you, Matthew.
I don't know if that was actually a direct message. So I have access to it.
Okay, I'm not quite sure. Anyway, is there anyone in the room who might like to follow up on that fascinating? As I said, it just felt like a real journey that you took us on, and yeah, really wonderful. So I have a couple of thoughts. I can kick off with those if you like. Oh no, you go ahead. Go on.
Hi.
Wondering about the relationship cinema. End of the 1930s, living there, and I don't know, especially because we were showing their father's photo that reminded of early 70s. Bringing back. So,
And magazine cultures, yeah, for sure. I mean, in some ways, film specifically, I think I've been a bit timid to touch because of the towering figure of Binod Roy, Manobina's husband, and that it would sort of then immediately become about him and about his visions, which could also be her visions. Like, I think that everyone is open to talking about it that way in their family as well. But so I haven't sort of done it as research, but I think a point that I maybe would like to make more generally about my dissertation, because it's built around these very close case studies of women who photographed, is not that I'm trying to say they were unique and they were doing something no one else was doing, but it's just like a way of showing actually photography was something people were engaging in. Even if they weren't able to own a camera or take photographs, it was omnipresent. And that's why I think Ranu Roy Chaudhary, who's written this dissertation that I hope she'll publish about photography as a kind of public art, a public good, a public, I don't know, maybe now I'm putting words into Ranu's mouth, but that's so important to me because I think it's something everybody had a stake in some way and could forge. So that avenue of looking at what else was coming in the house or what was going out of it or in the newspapers. And I think that's where I left some of the images, the impressions of Moscow pages with the ads next to it. And these things all obviously existed alongside each other. So yeah, but if you know more, you can also say more. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
As well as
yeah.
digitized from the 90s.
Okay, yeah, I'll have a look. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. My question was about amateurism and audience. So it seems like you think that amateurs have a different audience, they needed like for public. Because both Bihari and the twins, they seem to have a bit of an audience already through the coverage of
Yes.
So yeah, just a bit on your thoughts about does audience play into there's something about amateurs that they don't.
Yeah, I think that's what's maybe interesting about it. There's not so much this divide, like they would be doing this anyway at some level, or the audience are each other. And this strong sense of forging communities that aren't necessarily exclusive, but are like based around these shared interests. And I mean, it's actually amateurism is a kind of strand that I want to keep working on in my new project, which is about crowdsourcing and sort of coming together around archives and history of like cities, or like I'm from Bangalore, so Bangalore, but other things where it's like people want to do this and they want to share this, and I'm struck by how they would it's sort of shared regardless of whether you ask or whether there's an official podium to share it on, although that's also always there also seems to be a way in which that can quickly materialize. You can get together and have a do around it, and people seem to like that as well. So Yeah, I don't know, actually, audience is an interesting way to think about it, because there was a longer quote that I could have ended on, which is this Sean Cubitt's kind of manifesto for an amateur aesthetics. And he's very strong about it. He's like, there should be art without artists, politics without politicians, like this thing of and making art public doesn't just mean making your private art public, but a totally different kind of art. But I think because I haven't thought it through enough, I didn't include it.
Maybe if we just take the question that's online, just I can go back to it and then come back to the room where we are. There's a question here. I think you probably can read it, Mallika.
Yeah.
Just go. I'd like to ask how professional photographers reacted to these, in quotes, amateurs. For example, in the Photographic Association, one of the twins joined and then headed. What does it tell us about their, in quotes, amateurism?
Well, it kind of makes me think of Majid's question, because I didn't even really do it in relation to what were the professional photographers saying about it, or they never entered the picture, because it seemed like it was a bustling world even without that. And obviously there is gatekeeping and different people defining themselves against each other. I mean, if anything, maybe the amateurs are very keen to sometimes show that they're not professionals. And yeah, there's definitely a whole other piece of work I could and should do there around what are these different associations, who sees it as what is a professional association vis-a-vis a kind of amateur one. But yeah, in some way they proceed regardless or in spite of. And I don't know, because also Edward Said's lecture, which it is fortifying in some ways, because I mean, this was 93, but he's kind of talking about the university and where sort of the thing that's crushing people is neoliberalism as much as it is like old models of colonialism and stuff. And he's sort of wondering about what this amateur spirit would be of a non-specialist or a non-appointed person. And I don't know, because it's sort of deliberately naive, or it's deliberately not cynical. And maybe that's something worth staying with. Or even at the end, this reading of the photograph and how photography allows this man to, tower above the crowd, when maybe in life, in that crowd, he was kind of spoken down to. Like, maybe it's a fiction to say, oh, but photography allows that. But like, maybe we also do have fiction, so we can think with it. I don't know.
I was just wondering if we could go back to the previous slide. Can you control? Maybe. Yes. So my question was going to just be about, in your talk and the slides that you showed or shared with us, you shared some that show them with their cameras. And I just wondered who's taking the picture of them with their cameras and what they perhaps felt like being photographed, if you see what I'm getting at. And also, but I suppose that's it really. Is there something about the way we see them with their cameras that is part of the complications? Because somebody's photographing them, aren't they?
I mean, probably often it's each other.
Okay.
Or their father, or I mean, Binod Roy was a photographer, and he also got them really into photography and gave them a lot of magazines and things when they were sort of in their late teenage years. So there are others in the family wielding cameras. But when I was talking to for instance, Raj Sadedat, who was remembering about Debalina, he was saying I asked, like, would you talk about photography? How did you learn it? They all learned photography from the twins, more or less. Like, some took to it, some I think found it too taxing, or, I mean, because it requires so much attention and hard work, and it's daunting, this kind of note-taking and this kind of meticulousness. But he said, yes, they loved talking about photography, but about like doing it and seeing it, never about them, like not about them as photographers. So I think that's why I also like this idea of amateurism as activity rather than as identity, even though obviously it's determined by who you are and what you have access to. And just on that question, the poster that we chose, actually, that wasn't it. Like, what kind of a picture do we put on the poster? A picture by them, a picture of them, and in the end it is of them. And there's one where they have both their dark glasses on, and we thought maybe at least that gets at the kind of, Sabina in an article has called it the curious visions of Manobina. Maybe gets at the fact that it's about vision rather than just taking photographs.
So just one last follow-up. So there's no way we know kind of what they felt being photographed themselves, if you see what I mean.
They did say it.
Really?
I think, I mean, for instance, like studio photographs or things like that. I don't think that Debalina enjoyed that very much, nor taking some of those of her family. But her sister took her photograph that was used for her marriage and was sort of the lucky photograph. And so I think in certain instances you grin and bear it or have fun. But I think probably there's something about the power of being behind the camera and calling the shot. It's nice.
I see there's been another question in the chat, and I've lost the chat at the moment. Where's the chat gone? You can do it probably.
Oh, it can't.
Sorry about that. Oh, no.
Sorry. I want the chat.
Yes, there you go. I found the view of the Strand looking towards St Mary Le Strand particularly interesting. The photographer must have stood very close to number 145, which was the base of the India League, and where there you'll find the India Club, a remarkable restaurant,
that's lovely.
like a time capsule. What is more, one can see a camera shop that survived into the 90s, wonderful place specialising in high quality second-hand equipment. So
thank you very much for that. I didn't even think that far about the actual shops around them. I trusted fully in what their pictures were showing me to direct my research. But thank you so much.
Can I just ask one wee question about father? You showed his entry in the yes.
Yeah.
I may be wrong, but I recall in some of that as part of the process of becoming a member, you had to submit examples of work. So does that mean that in the archive, which are examples of work?
Yes, I think there must be some. When I was doing my PhD, it wasn't easy for me to access it, and they hadn't digitized much yet. And now it's something that I can go back and look for. I was trying to find it, but I think I'm just making us dizzy by going through. Yeah, for sure that must be there. And he would have also sent and shared things.
And one final just I'm retired from, but before I retired, we received a gift from my wife, one of film fair.
Okay,
Had been awarded, and it's on display.
Yeah, oh, interesting.
So that, but I didn't know anything about
his wife and his family.
Wife and Joy Roy's mother.
Yeah.
With him.
Yeah, I mean, the exhibition that's come together now, and also the one that there's been now a few exhibitions. This is the first time of both of them together. But Joy Roy, Manobina's son, has really taken that on to kind of try to also show his mother's images.
Joy's mother was which one?
Manobina.
All that is I don't know. How
Yeah. So a very obvious counterpoint is the person that Sabina Gadi wrote a really beautiful biography of, which is Homai Vayarwala, who was the first photojournalist in India and woman photojournalist. And a lot of her activity was totally contemporaneous to the twins. And so there are examples of what that would mean and what that would look like. And Homai, I think Sabina's actually giving a talk tonight or tomorrow about Homai, but she also had to earn a living and started because her partner was already involved in making photographs, and she kind of joined him and then also just was really good at it and managed to make a living out of it. But it wasn't sort of a pet project or a hobby, because she couldn't afford it to be. So there's that. And there's lots of different people taking lots of different kinds of photographs in India. And some of them, these Durga Puja ones, I think are really nice to compare with some of the very well-known photographs that André Cartier-Bresson and others took of also Durga Puja or ritual processions and things, and this emphasis on angles and movement and and Debalina and Manobina knew about them and had their books and loved their photographs. And when they're talking with their children about what makes a good photograph, they're mainly using these images to talk about it. So there's a wide world of it, and there's also a strand of women professional sort of studio photographers who were able to sort of fulfill that need to take photographs of women who were in Purda. And I guess mostly it's known in Bengal, which, the twins are not different to that. But it will be exciting as this starts to expand and people are looking at studio photographs and other practices in South India and other places.
Which also reminds me also earliest videos.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much.
I wonder if there are any further comments or questions. I don't think anybody's added. No. So, well, we've kept you very busy for over an hour talking to us and sharing your work with us. So
thank you for listening dedicatedly.
We look forward to the next step or the next stage in this ongoing project, and I'm sure you're going to continue really keeping people enthralled in the way that you have kept us enthralled today. And I think the broader points that you are so introducing about amateurism, I think again, generate, there's a lot of food for thought there, I think, beyond your immediate project as well, in terms of how what you're describing, what you're discussing, how you're analysing this work. I think it will have very broad reach in due course. So I'm looking forward to hearing more about that too. I just love the way you said amateurism, that space to be imperfect.
Yeah.
You said something along those lines.
Well,
Well, when you refer to that, though, I think it's, I think we need more spaces to be imperfect in the present time we live in, where there's this obsession with perfection. I think what's perfection mean, and I think these photographs tell us a lot about the importance of keeping things in perspective, literally and through the camera. So I'll stop at this point and say thank you very much, Mallika, and thank you again.